During the 1970s, I recall first hearing the use of the term commie at my junior high school. At the time, I had no idea what this word meant, let alone how it made its way into the repertoire of 8th grade boys who were still hunting lizards and snakes in their spare time after school. The spread of the term commie into American schools, even elementary schools, was a reflection of the broader Cold War culture that saturated American life at that time. The US had spent decades portraying communism as the enemy, and that narrative permeated pop culture, media, and education. TV shows, cartoons, movies, and comics often painted communists, or commies, as villains. School curricula included anti-communist messaging, especially in history, civics, and social studies. The Pledge of Allegiance, which had added "under God" in 1954, explicitly differentiated the US from godless communism. Duck and cover air raid drills reinforced that the enemy was real, and that, of course, they were communists. This intense us versus them worldview of Cold War America trickled down into the subconscious of children, who often repeated the rhetoric they heard with only a superficial understanding. But this was just part and parcel with a culture that was already riddled with contradictions, which were difficult to miss, even in our youth, such as the fact that the values clearly being upheld in the popular culture were so antithetical to the Christian values that were supposed to be so important. No need to recite all the song lyrics we were already surrounded by in the 60s and 70s. And this is to say nothing of what Hollywood was up to. No one I knew, including myself, was complaining about it. It was just the way it was, and frankly, kinda cool at the time. Of course, I had no idea that a sex, drugs, and rock and roll spree, and others in a similar orbit, had already been used by various governments, especially Western ones, to influence, pacify, distract, or destabilize populations, both at home and abroad. But the contradiction between the supposed Christian values and popular culture was a glaring one, even for us 8th graders. Which brings us back to Marx and the most important facet of his philosophy, dialectical materialism, which tells us that for change to occur, opposition is essential. While communism is attributed to Karl Marx, he was not a statesman, nor was he wealthy. In fact, he relied heavily on financial support from his close friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels, who co-authored works like the Communist Manifesto with him. Despite these rather humbling facts, Marx is considered to be one of the most influential sociopolitical theorists in history, the legacy of whom still shapes debates in philosophy, economics, politics, history, and sociology. Moreover, despite these impressive credentials, Marx has somehow become one of the most controversial figures in the modern political discourse. And, predictably, we have the mass media and education system to thank for helping us to misunderstand Marx so thoroughly. In academia, dialectical materialism is often referred to as the philosophical foundation or even the very essence of Marxism. Outside of academia, however, where the influence of mass media and the education system encourage us to be ideologues rather than critical thinkers, dialectical materialism is relatively unheard of. Dialectical materialism is the result of a long continuity of revelation that Marx is an important part of, but one that has roots in classical antiquity, in an idea simply called dialectic. Plato called it the coping stone of the sciences and considered it to be the capstone of a complete education. As one of the 7 liberal arts, dialectic was central in European and colonial American schooling before the arrival of forced state-funded schooling. Greatly influenced by the classical interpretation, Enlightenment philosophers like Hegel and the German idealists began applying the concept of dialectic much more broadly as the very mechanism by which change occurs and history unfolds. This conception of dialectic involves tension between 2 opposing ideas and then eventually some sort of synthesis or reconciliation of them. Dialectical movement is the very process of becoming, the very process of history unfolding, in which something incorporates its other into itself and a new element appears, over and over again. Each stage in the historical process contains the seeds of its own destruction, but also a new potential. Influenced by the Enlightenment idealists, and particularly Hegel, Marx and Engels came up with another adaptation of dialectic, now widely referred to as dialectical materialism, though Marx and Engels didn't actually use this term themselves. This conception held that history is dialectical but is driven by material conditions rather than ideas, and that history inevitably progresses through stages, from feudalism to capitalism, socialism, and eventually, communism. British scientist J.B.S. Haldane, one of the founders of neo-Darwinism, has described this conception as the science of the general laws of change, not only in society and in human thought, but in the external world which is mirrored by human thought. He also described it as not merely a philosophy of history, but a philosophy which illuminates all events whatever, from the falling of a stone to a poet's imaginings. Because dialectical materialism predicts the rise of communism and a classless society as inevitable and necessitates the suppression of individual rights, authoritarian leaders have seen this as a convenient philosophical basis for portraying themselves as agents of historical necessity. So-called Marxism has been promoted not by Marx, but by social elites who needed a philosophical basis to validate their authoritarian aspirations, who found that Marxist thought contained elements, including dialectical materialism, that served their aspirations well. Marx lived in relative poverty, and his widespread acclaim and recognition came posthumously. He never provided a detailed guide for implementing communism. The first major political leader to ostensibly implement Marxist ideology was Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Party and the architect of the Russian Revolution of 1917, which led to the overthrow of the Russian Provisional Government. Lenin used the language of Marxian bottom-up governance, where workers directly control the means of production, to sell his authoritarian policy. Marx's so-called dictatorship of the proletariat was supposed to be a temporary, transitional phase in which the working class would seize political power and dismantle capitalist structures before moving toward a classless, stateless, communist society. But under Lenin, what was presented as a temporary sacrifice for the greater good somehow turned into the militarization of the state, mass surveillance, suppression of political freedoms, purges, and labor camps, at which time Marx had already been dead for 35 years. All this greatly intensified under Stalin, who in turn was the global figurehead of communism during Mao's rise to power in the 1930s and 1940s, and the Russian example influenced Mao heavily. But they all cherry-picked Marxism for the aspects which lent themselves to their own authoritarian aspirations. None really wanted anything to do with other core aspects of Marxism, such as bottom-up governance or a stateless, classless society. Karl Popper, one of the 20th century's most influential philosophers of science, was critical of the deterministic nature of dialectic and the way it was exploited by Lenin and later Stalin to justify authoritarian policy in Russia. In 1945, in his seminal work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, Popper maintains that a free and open society uses ethics, science, and rationalism to make decisions, and should never look at outcomes as inevitable or preordained. In the book, Popper also makes an important distinction between utopian social engineering and piecemeal social engineering. The latter, according to Popper, could be desirable if it involved only incremental, small-scale changes to address specific societal issues. The former, on the other hand, involved overly ambitious, totalizing efforts to overhaul society as a whole, and tended to lead to authoritarianism and the suppression of dissent in the name of achieving the greater good. In America today, there is little doubt which version we are seeing, considering the misinformation being disseminated in the media, which challenges long-standing values and beliefs, like how many genders there are, how we should deal with dangerous pathogens in public health, and whether or not we should be concerned about aliens and UFOs. This misinformation, as well as the overt suppression of dissent we've recently seen in social media, are telltale signs of an authoritarian trend. This creates widespread fear, anxiety, and cognitive dissonance, which prepare the citizenry for imminent paradigm shifts which would not otherwise have been tolerated. If Maoist China and Leninist Stalinist Russia taught us anything, it taught us that citizens faced with the dissonance between their own observable reality and the official state narrative resolved the conflict by lying to themselves and allowing themselves to believe their acquiescence was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the country. The extreme degree of polarization which the media promotes will facilitate this because historical change is dialectical. Opposition is a prerequisite, and while opposition promotes change, controlled opposition is even better. And this is precisely what the few who control information have. Either side may be cast wearing the white hats. It's little surprise then to see the uptick in allusions to various important dichotomies, whether Marxism versus capitalism, fascism versus communism, or even the usual conservatism versus progressivism. These are just old ideas which have been turned into social constructs by the few who control information to manipulate mass perceptions. In reality, no country in the world can perfectly be described as Marxist, fascist, capitalist, or communist. In other words, while the phenomenon of dialectic is perfectly natural, it is also very exploitable. It's who controls information and decides where to point the cameras that matters, not the philosophy du jour. And thus we can expect the media to continue promoting emotional dialogue and severe polarization. These few are like the gardener who gets to decide which plants are deemed weeds and which are not, or like the vintner who enjoys the luxury of controlling the pH and the nutrient levels of a wine must. If these few want the emotions of citizenry at fever pitch, then that's precisely what they will have. This is what rarely gets any mention, and what makes a perfectly natural dialectic into a very unnatural and emotionally centered one. Here is why so many are talking about what is clearly a social science as if it were a physical one. This is also the reason so many people don't just disagree with the other side, they actually revile them. If this level of polarization doesn't tip us off that there's a serious problem afoot, then whatever could. All the saber-rattling, pom-pom waving, and finger-wagging does nothing to move the dial in any measurable way, and the devil always comes to his own funeral, almost as if someone was manipulating the very course of history. So round and round we go. Like moths to a porch light, we can't seem to resist the perpetual state of melodrama. And it matters little which side prevails. The better question is, did the authoritarian viewpoint prevail? If our society becomes a digital dictatorship, as the social elites at the World Economic Forum have asserted is rapidly approaching, and we find ourselves in a world where we are considered useless if we don't hack ourselves with brain-computer interfaces, as they have also suggested, does it matter which side prevailed?